Now, at the last election, Reform UK made a lot of political hay as an insurgent movement, promising the contentious policy of net zero immigration, something that I had issue with as a one-in, one-out policy, but at least they wanted a freeze on the overall number of the population being added to by immigration, and also banning things like halal slaughter and preventing any blasphemy laws. So they're really taking the sort of cultural fight against mass immigration and Islamism. One person that was fantastic at that was Ben Habib. Ben Habib was interviewed by Bo when he was still a candidate, but I've spoken to Ben before and deprogrammed. He is an absolute gentleman. He's a fantastic contributor to the likes of Talk TV and GB News. He was, I think, Reform's strongest spokesperson. And this is no shade on the politicians who, after the election, Richard Tice, Lee Anderson, have been very stalwart in calling out two-tier policing, and the likes of Hope Not Hate getting away with, in some cases, almost literal murder by mobilising armed Muslim militias out on the streets. But it's a shame because Ben is now no longer the deputy leader of Reform UK. And I think that Reform have set themselves back a little bit by doing this. And if any of you are curious as to why this is the case, I believe we have Ben Habib waiting in the wings right now. If all things are going well, Ben, are you able to hear me?
I can. Good afternoon, Connor. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, sir. Very good to hear from you again. Right, well, I'm sure lots of people have basically been waiting over the Lotus Eaters to hear from someone from Reform, because as far as I understand it from internal conversations, because a couple of our members, Bo and Dan, went to run as candidates and were deselected before even the sort of great wave of deselections happened, our outlet is not looked upon favourably by some people in Reform, and that I don't think that necessarily includes me, because I think I'm probably, having appeared on Trigonometry and GB News and the like, a bit more brand safe. But I do know there is some bad blood there. So I think my audience is going to very much appreciate hearing what the inside of the general election campaign was like, considering you fought it. How did you actually feel the general election campaign went first?
Well, we had our ups and we had our downs. In the end, I thought we did pretty well. Not pretty well. I thought we did exceptionally well. I think we made political history. We were an insurgent party that got 5 seats when 6 months ago people were saying we were going to get no seats. It was disappointing in the last furlong when, on the night itself, when we were predicted to get 13 seats. At one point, I thought to myself, I'm going to go to bed at 10 o'clock and I'll wake up for my count at whatever time I had to head over to the thing. And then I saw the news that we were forecast to get 13 seats. So I stayed up all night, didn't get the result of my count till 6 a.m. And in the finish, we got 5. But, staggering result for a party that has come from nowhere effectively 3 years ago to now presenting an existential threat to the Conservative Party.
Yeah, and I do have to ask the question, obviously, because we are on Lotus Eaters. What were your thoughts about how the candidate deselections were handled? Like, let's be fair, some of them were absolutely off-the-wall kooks. Others, I think the tone was set by enemy NGOs like Hope Not Hate that will never give anyone a fair shake. Do you have any thoughts on that, looking back on how that was handled?
Yeah, so it's very hard for anyone, I think, to express an opinion without getting into the detail of why any individual candidate was deselected. And I think deselection needs to be a very high bar. Once someone has made the selection process, there's got to be a damn good reason to remove them. That's the first thing. The second thing is we know that we were bound to be attacked. People were going to want to throw stuff at us to discredit us, and we needed to be strong where we were entitled and right to be strong, and we shouldn't, give in to any of that. Having said all of that, it is quite a difficult path to navigate, and I had some sympathy with Richard Tice having to, go through a general election with lots of mud being chucked at the party. People going through our candidates in a way they didn't go through the Labour Party candidates or the Conservative candidates, who, by the way, have a number of kooks in amongst them as well, And I'm sure we didn't get every decision right, and we would have deselected people who shouldn't have been deselected under pressure. And I'm sure that there are some who should have been deselected, but were never found out by those who were doing their, due diligence on us. Remember, we went from 450 candidates on the 23rd of May 22nd of May when the general election was called, to fielding 611 candidates, very nearly every single seat in Great Britain. And if you count 25 seats out of 650, that's no mean feat, and difficult to get candidate selection absolutely right, as an insurgency on a shoestring with that challenge.
Yeah, well, I raise, obviously, Beau's example because Isabel Oakeshott, obviously the partner of Richard Tice, herself a pretty strong reform policy spokeswoman, wrote, I thought, very good piece in Telegraph the other day saying that we need mass deportations. The likes of Sweden and Germany, even Pakistan have tabled these. And this was something that Beau did get deselected over. Now, of course, we're a broadcast platform on the Lotus Eaters. We're a bit like GB News in that the hosts often lock horns and disagree and don't exactly present themselves in exactly the same way. I happen to think you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar, and Beau, people love Beau for being very vinegarish. But I do think that Reform have strengthened their rhetoric in a way that they would have deselected prior candidates for, but now feel emboldened to do so now. So why do you think that rhetorical strengthening has changed? Is it just because they won the election and feel safe to do so?
I don't know. I don't know if the rhetorical sort of the way that Reform is expressing itself has necessarily changed. It might be that there isn't a completely uniform approach to everything. And, I don't know the ins and outs of Beau's deselection. I know he was deselected. I don't know the ins and outs of it. And I'm a bit hesitant to comment on it, Connor, without, looking at it in detail. But I've got a great sympathy with what Isabel said. I think we do need to have significant deportations taking place. It's easier said than done, of course, because you have to have a country on the other side of the process that's going to take them. We don't have an arrangement with Afghanistan. So what do? Fly them in under the cover of darkness and leave them on the tarmac at Kabul airport. It ain't so easy, and I keep coming back on the subject itself of deportation. I keep coming back to the fact that we need robust border control. Deportation is what you do when border control has failed. And, it's something that our political class don't seem to take on board, particularly the last Conservative government, who thought that you could control borders purely through the threat of deportation. But deportation is like, you've been, so I'm trying to think of a palatable way to describe this on an afternoon program. But, if you don't want to get pregnant, make sure you have contraceptives. Contraceptives are the way to not to get rid of the baby. That's a very, very difficult decision to make and a high bar to cross. So deportation's always going to be complex, always going to be fraught with expense, difficulty, judicial, challenges, etc. The easiest way to protect our borders is stop people coming in the first place, which is what our forefathers managed to do for centuries. But we've somehow lost the political will to do it, and we don't seem to understand what borders are. And I think we've got to drive that message home relentlessly. Borders exist because they've come to exist over thousands of years to protect the tribes within those borders, and they need to be physically, robustly enforced.
I mean, us being the nature, being an island might give that impression, but of course, nowhere is safe from the clutches of global homogeneity. I will say I have noticed a strengthening in rhetoric, particularly from Richard. There's a difference between, taking hopes not hate's lead on who may or may not be palatable to every day admirably calling for the arrest of Nick Lowles for spreading misinformation online. And kudos to Richard for that. But obviously, you've been involved in reform for quite some time, especially since the Brexit Party days. And I remember reading your piece in The Times that urged for democratic reform, some of which is going through. You were given some guarantees when you joined the Brexit Party. Can you explain to our viewers what those are and why those haven't necessarily been met?
So when I joined the Brexit Party, just to be clear, Connor, when I joined the Brexit Party, I was given no guarantees. I actually didn't know what the structure of the Brexit Party was. It was brand new back in March 2019. And I joined it just, hot off hot off the plate, as it were. And it was my first brush with political experience, my first foray into politics. But I learned, obviously, as I went on as a Brexit Party MEP, what the structure was. And just to remind viewers that the Brexit Party, now renamed Reform UK Limited, is a limited liability company registered at Companies House with 15 shares, 8 of which used to be owned by Nigel. He now owns 9. Richard has 5, and 1 share is owned by a guy called Mehrtash Azami, who is the accountant. But being a private limited company, Nigel owning 9 out of 15 shares, 60%, is an outright controller of the party. And during the course of my membership of the Brexit Party, before we effectively disbanded in January 2020, it became known to me what the structure of the party was. And also we made that historically significant decision to stand down against the Tories, 317 candidates, uniformly against the Tories, standing down against people like Theresa May, Tobias Ellwood, and others who actually we should never have shown the light of day, and actually standing against Caroline Flint, for example, who was a good Labour Brexiteer, and she lost her office because we stood against her, but we stood down against Theresa May. And I wasn't happy with that decision. It was a decision that was made unilaterally on high. I don't know how the decision was made, and I regretted at the time the decision was made, and I regret it now still, because Boris Johnson was afforded an 80-seat majority, and he delivered his withdrawal agreement on the strength of the democratic vote that he got from the British people. But we all knew in the Brexit Party, everyone in the Brexit Party, all the MEPs knew that Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement was not Brexit. We all knew Northern Ireland was going to be left behind. We all knew that we'd be committed to all sorts of areas of legal compliance with the European Union, including a suggestion of military, military cooperation, military interoperability, as they call it, effectively making our troops compliant with EU, hardware and software, and therefore making it very difficult. And we're heading back in this direction again, by the way. Very difficult for our country to have an independent military. And if you don't have an independent military, if you're signed up to the hip on state aid law, competition law, environment law, employment law, you're committed to the European Court of Human Rights and the agreement that we signed with the European Union, and you put a border down the Irish Sea. I don't call that Brexit. In no shape or form do I call that Brexit. What we voted to do was to take back control from Brussels entirely, and for the United Kingdom to leave the EU entirely. There was no ifs and buts and 2 new treaties, we'll do this and a bit of that. There was none of that. And so it wasn't Brexit. And I've been condemned, for want of a better word, fighting the Northern Ireland Protocol ever since then because of the withdrawal agreement. So I feel it very personally. I've put tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds into fighting that Irish Sea border personally. And so I feel that that decision was not a good decision to allow Boris Johnson to deliver his withdrawal agreement. I even said, by the way, on Sophie Ridge, during the general election in 2019, I said I'd rather remain in the EU than have the withdrawal agreement as drafted, because at least that would have given us the ability, when it came to a proper withdrawal, to withdraw, properly. If we got another opportunity, we could withdraw properly. And so when Richard Tice approached me in late 2022 with now what was called Reform UK and said, will you join Reform UK? I said, only if it's democratized, because I don't want another decision of such magnitude being made without, some ability for influencing that decision. And I think Nigel needs to give up his shares in the company. We need to spread those shares around. There's no such thing as a pure democracy, but we need some mechanism by which there are checks and balances put in place. And and I'll join if you democratized the party. And Richard and Nigel declined to give up their shares in the party, so I settled for a letter from Richard that made a number of promises, which is that we would fight for Brexit, we'd fight to regain Northern Ireland from the European Union. There would be no deals with the Tory party in any forthcoming general election. We wouldn't stand down against the Tories, which was critical in my view, and running the party consensually. And to be fair to Richard, he basically adhered to those undertakings, and we made a lot of progress. When I joined the party, we were polling 6%. When the general election was called on the 22nd of May, we were polling 16%. And we'd had some notable, wins in inverted commas on the way. And but of course, then Nigel came back. He appointed himself leader on the 3rd of June, and the letter had no substance at that point. And so I began again behind the scenes saying, listen, Richard, we had an agreement. Nigel's back as leader. We've got to democratize because it ain't going to work. And I was quietly putting that pressure on during the general election because that was no time to be publicly banging the table wanting a restructuring of the party. And before the end of the general election, the last week, I started ramping it up again. And I wanted to do it before the end of the general election because I didn't want people to think Ben's let the general election run and now he's causing a fuss. I wanted people to know that this is something I held dear throughout. And so I made the case in the final week of the general election that the party has to democratize. And then Nigel made a speech later that week on the Friday after the general election. So I made my little speech on Monday. Nigel spoke about the democratization of the party on Friday, the day after the general election. But Nigel didn't talk about the democratization of the party itself. What he talked about was the creation of democratic branch structures. Now, that's quite different. That's having a series of branches across the UK, all of them electing their own branch, treasurer, chairman, president, whatever it is, choosing candidates, very, very important process, of course, and a very welcome one for Reform UK. Absolutely the right thing for the party to be doing. But it didn't make a declaration that the party itself would be democratized. And that's critical because otherwise the party at high level can just trump any decisions coming up from the people. And the other thing that I think is really important is that having marched 4.1 million people up to the top of the hill, and there would have been many other millions who would have voted for us if they thought that they weren't splitting the right-wing vote or that, a vote for reform was a wasted vote like the Tories were saying. I'm sure we've got many other millions of votes. Having got these people energized, we have a duty of care in Reform UK to deliver on the promises we've made. It is not in our gift any longer to make policies willy-nilly and change direction. It's not in our gift. We've made promises already. We've moved people who were despondent into a position of hope and aspiration that we said we would deliver. And we cannot go back on that now. The party, in my view, no longer belongs to any individual. Having marched these people to the top of the hill, the party, in all moral senses, belongs to the people. And therefore, we must give those people a voice. And so I've been banging with ever greater stridency the drum for democratization. And then I was very, very pleased to hear Zia Youssef, the new chairman, declare on GB News last week that actually Nigel was going to give up his shares and that there would be democracy at the top of the party and there would be a process by which the leader could be removed. Not because I want Nigel removed, but because if you don't have the ability to remove the leader, you've got no way for the people to express their view. And actually the leader can then run rogue without any checks on him. And however great a guy Nigel is, no leader should have the ability to do that. Every leader needs to be held in check. And so I was delighted to hear Zia Youssef's declaration. And I will now obviously be monitoring that very closely.
Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m, only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.